Members of Venezuela's newly created National Constitutional Assembly have voted to prosecute opposition politicians who supported the latest U.S. sanctions against the country. Last week, Washington imposed financial penalties against Caracas in an effort to cut back funds for the already severely cash-strapped government. On Friday, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro accused his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump of waging what he described as an economic war to push the country into default. Venezuela's also begun nationwide armed forces exercises, calling on civilians to join reserve units to defend against a possible attack after President Trump warned that a military option was on the table for the crisis-hit country.
A vast chunk of the Amazon rainforest that was protected for over 30 years now open to mining. The area, larger than Denmark, is thought to have significant reserves of copper, gold, and iron ore. The government says allowing and regulating mining there would stamp out illegal operations destroying the forest. It insists that protected areas and indigenous land will not be affected, and it's now promised a new decree spelling out these protections. The prospect of a gold rush in this fragile area has sparked overwhelming criticism from lawmakers and environmentalists alike. Even supermodel Gisele Bündchen has accused the government of auctioning the Amazon. U.S. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania have landed in Texas to survey the response to the catastrophic flooding caused by Tropical Storm Harvey. In Corpus Christi, near where Harvey first made landfall last week, Trump said he wants the relief effort to be an example of how to respond to a storm.
We want to do it better than ever before. We want to be looked at in 5 years and 10 years from now as this is the way to do it. This was of epic proportion. Nobody's ever seen anything like this.
The flooding has killed at least 9 people so far and paralyzed Houston, the country's 4th biggest city. Residents have been urged to evacuate as reservoirs in and around the city start to overflow. Brazoria County, south of Houston, also called for immediate evacuations around a levee that was breached by the floodwaters. The storm has drawn comparisons with Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans exactly 12 years ago. So far, more than 3,500 people have been rescued from high waters in the Houston area, and some 30,000 are expected to seek emergency shelter.
North Korea's leader has called for more missile launches into the Pacific, flouting international fury. The rogue nation's official news agency said Monday's ballistic test over Japan was the first step of a military operation in the area and a prelude to containing Guam. Earlier this month, North Korea threatened to fire 4 missiles near Guam, which is home to a major U.S. military base. Pyongyang says the latest launch was also to counter US and South Korea military drills on its border. Pyongyang's actions triggered an emergency meeting of the 15-member UN Security Council in New York. The Council's president said the Security Council calls North Korea's actions outrageous and demands that it immediately cease all such activities. Japan welcomed the US drafted statement, which was agreed by the Council, but it fell short of threatening new sanctions. Both China and Russia opposed unilateral restrictions on North Korea and repeated calls to halt deployment of a US missile defense system in South Korea.
China is discussing the situation over North Korea with other members of the United Nations Security Council and has vowed to make a necessary response based on the consensus reached. Speaking at a news briefing in Beijing, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi urged all parties to stick to peaceful and diplomatic means to find a resolution to tensions on the Korean peninsula.
There's another important part to the Security Council, which is to persist in using peaceful and diplomatic methods to solve the peninsula nuclear issue, and to call for a return to dialogue as soon as possible, especially a resumption of the 6-party talks, and to ask all sides not to continue with actions that will make the situation more tense.
The United Nations have condemned North Korea's firing of a ballistic missile over Japan, demanding Pyongyang halt its weapons program, but holding back on any threat of new sanctions on the isolated regime.
Nearly 500 migrants have been rescued by Libya's Coast Guard and taken to Tripoli naval base. 3 different groups were picked up drifting off the Libyan coast. They included women and children. They're the latest in a summer wave of migrants from mainly sub-Saharan countries, Morocco and Tunisia, to risk their lives attempting to cross the Mediterranean in a bid to get into southern Europe. Elias was one of them.
I was going to Italy with a boat when our engine got spoiled.
Meanwhile, the Libyan authorities have deported 75 Nigerians back to their home country. It comes as European and African leaders meeting in Paris agreed to set up a register to identify those fleeing persecution and war before they set off on a perilous journey across the sea.
It's being described as the longest bridge of its type in the world and the biggest infrastructure project in Scotland in a generation. The state-of-the-art Queensferry crossing over the River Forth has been completed and will open to traffic on Wednesday. The 2.7-kilometre bridge is the third in as many centuries to link Edinburgh and the north of Scotland. Construction took 6 years and cost some £1.35 billion. The rising threat of militant attacks against security forces has led Belgium to change patrolling tactics. The new commander of Belgian land forces says troops will move around more often and change patrol routes. This after a string of attacks against soldiers and police in Belgium, Britain and France.
What we do see, and that's why we want to be more mobile, is that when you're unpredictable and more mobile, you're a lot safer. So you can do your job a lot better. You can be more effective. That's why we want to work like that.
France has seen over a dozen attacks on soldiers and police since 2015, with a man recently driving a car into soldiers in Paris. On Friday, a man attacked police with a sword in London, and soldiers in Brussels shot dead a man who attacked them with a knife.
Officials in Saudi Arabia say almost 2 million worshippers have arrived in Mecca for the annual Hajj pilgrimage. The week of sacred rituals starts on Wednesday. It's a once-in-a-lifetime obligation for able-bodied Muslims from around the world. Security is an issue. The authorities have been preparing for months to handle any violence, disease or a crush like the one that killed hundreds in 2015.
It's pretty decent here. It's pretty well organized, I'd say, and the traffic obviously is crazy, but apart from that, everything's pretty well done. I like the fact that they've organized it in an electronic way as well, because everyone has to get a custody. You know, before it was like open for everyone, so now it's like pretty organized. That's a good thing.
30,000 health workers are on hand and 5,000 hospital beds have been made available. 7 women have been taken on to work in the emergency call centre. Analysts are describing this as a big shift for conservative Saudi Arabia.
Nel momento ora para espaço comercial, ora nos back e deporte.
Programa com mais de uma década de informação.